And really what we need to do, what I'd like to do right at the moment is to get Tom Asbridge up here and let him describe whatever it is that he's attempting or wants to do. I think he's going to describe the view, what it looks like when our money system at the physical economy level doesn't work anymore. And to think that monetary reform is simply something to pursue for goodness's sake, I think needs some skin hung on it so that we can stare it in the face and find out what it really means. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tom Asbridge.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. I thought it was appropriate for me to put my uniform on this morning rather than be as casual as I would be more comfortable in, because I think of the nature of the topic, that's the way I would prefer to present it. I'm rather new to the American Monetary Institute. People, last fall, I attended the conference in Chicago with Randy and found it, uplifting and interesting, and finally finding people who were struggling as we were to try to find some answers to the economic riddle that was confronting not just our country, but the world. And I'll give you just a bit of background for myself. I'm kind of like Joe. I'm not an academic. I come from the physical world. My family has been in the ranching business in North Dakota since before statehood. And my great-grandfather came here from Great Britain in 1881 and settled in Dakota Territory. My grandfather established our family ranch in 1900 prior to homesteading. And until 2016, I wasn't aware that that land, just shortly before he arrived there, had been stolen from the Lakota Nation. I didn't know it. I was unaware. They just moved the borders arbitrarily. That opened up the land where our ranch laid. And I don't know whether my family was aware of that, but in my lifetime, it was never discussed. And it was just a movement from a river, the Cannonball River, to the Cedar River. It was about 15 miles. The federal government just changed the border and eliminated hundreds of thousands of acres that belonged to them by the Treaty of 1854 without much of a consultation with the natives. So that was an interesting find for me. My background in ranching, of course, as a kid, I was in 4-H and FFA and learned all the things you're supposed to learn. One of the great myths that I was taught, and as far as I know, everybody in my business has been taught, is that the market is in control. And the market is a myth. It's mythological, it's magic, and there's nobody can control it. It just is. So, technically, that's what led Carl Wilkin to his research and discoveries when he went to the elevator in Iowa one morning to inquire about selling a load of corn and found that it was 88 cents a bushel. Said, fine, I'll bring a load in tomorrow. And when he got there, the next day it was 40 cents a bushel. What happened? It was the same number 2 yellow corn. What did that? Why was that? Why would a man's labor for the year be changed in monetary value at the whim of some trader in Chicago? But we all in agriculture believe that the market is a mythological place that can't be tampered with. So one of the things that I have tried to educate my fellow agriculturalists on, with very little success, is that, for instance, a bushel of wheat has 2 values. One, a 60-pound bushel of wheat makes 60 loaves of bread. We eat it. We need it for sustenance. But the other factor is the value of that wheat as it flows into the economy. And that's what I learned from Charles Walters and Carl Wilkin. Now, I was a true believer in the marketplace, and the only thing you can do as a producer is to get more efficient. So I did what the land-grant university said. I got more efficient, a lot more efficient. And to get more efficient meant not only did you have to keep your cost of production as low and continue to take advantage of new technology, but you had to expand production. You had to grow more and more. You know, in other words, you needed a bigger truck. And I bought that theory, hook, line, and sinker, and did that. And in our operation, I doubled and redoubled the size of it till it was at the industrialized level, until the market changed things for me and it all collapsed. And that led me to study of what happened. Because one thing that I knew, and whether it sounds arrogant or not, I can't help that, but I knew that the problem wasn't my skills as a producer. My efficiency was unquestionable. My ability to do all these things, I was as good as certainly needed to be successful. So what happened? And that's when I started to discover raw material economics, and then of course ultimately led to Soddy. And by the way, Joe's presentation on Frederick Soddy is stunning. And those of you who haven't read Frederick Soddy, I used one of Soddy's books, Wealth, Virtual Wealth, and Debt, to go to sleep, because it is so arcane and so British, and some of his sentences were a paragraph long. I just read it at night and I'd fall asleep. So, but Soddy's insights were incredible. And now let me get to the point here that I think is relevant. As a producer, I look at the world different than many of you who are consumers. And the real picture of agriculture in America today is not what's on the television and not what's being portrayed. It is in dire straits. And that's just economically. The consequences to the environment by what we're doing in agriculture is as serious as what's happening to climate change. And it is crucial that we change the way we produce the food that we eat, not just for the benefits of the health of all of us who consume, but for the future of the soil that produces the food that we eat. And as Charles Walters taught me, you know, all life on this planet is truly dependent on the top 6 inches of soil. And it's, in particular in the Great Plains where I'm familiar, the soil is being mined to produce more and more production. And the theory of feeding the world is where we're at. And now it's nonsense. It is harmful. It is, but it has been bought hook, line, and sinker by the agricultural producers, by the farmers of this country. And honestly, they have little choice. You just don't have an option. You have to produce more and more and more and more. And one of the consequences that's not acknowledged, when you produce more bushels on an acre, those bushels have less value nutritiously. So we have changed the profile of the food that we eat without paying much attention to it. And I would submit that when you take a look around America, and the epidemic of obesity is certainly related to the quality of the food that we produce. But as far as the economics of it, in my home country, rural America has been emptied out. And I'll talk about the Great Plains here because that's my country, from the Canadian border to the tip of Texas. It's emptied. It is completely emptied. It is a fraction of what it was only 20 years ago. Once the laws changed and we went off a par economy in 1952, it all began to change, and very slowly, very slowly. It's so slow that it's not recognized. But towns that in the center of the Great Plains that were 3,000 are now 1,000 or less. Schools that were graduating 80 students are now graduating 10 to 20. It has been gutted. And the attitude there is there's nothing we can do about it. We have to feed the world. And the consequences of that are our communities have been gutted. I could tell you, to me, I just thought of a story this morning that I'll try to share with you that is kind of reflective of how agriculture works. Agriculture today is being financed by inflation because the prices of the commodities are so low now at about 30% of parity that the only way you can finance farming operation is on land inflation. And the way land inflation has been carried out is just lend enough money to someone to buy a piece of land. And of course, that changes the balance sheets of all the people within X number of miles. So we have in our part of the world where it's mostly grass and not as much farming, although farming there has expanded and lots of grasslands that should be grass are now farmed. 20 years ago in my township, there wouldn't have been an acre of corn. Now there's thousands of acres of corn in a place that we shouldn't be growing corn. Only to feed the world. It's not to feed the livestock that are there, it's to feed the world. So land that, to me, with knowledge of the grasses, that's pretty good, how the grasses work, how they can be grazed, how you convert them into beef, that should be from $50 to $100 per acre, even under a par economy, are selling from $800 to $1,200 an acre, 10 to 20 times its productive value. That's in order to float the financing, to keep all of the balls in the air. And as the balls drop, we just shrug our shoulders and make sure the guy that's next to it, he gets his neighbor's farm, because that's the only way to survive. So I think we've hit the limits on the debt expansion on land inflation in agriculture, not just in the Great Plains, but everywhere. How that's going to manifest itself over the next year or two or three remains a mystery, but it can't continue on the path that it's on. One of the things that I thought of was the old story about the fellow in Iowa that was a corn farmer, and he decided he could produce enough corn to feed cattle, so he went to the bank to borrow money. And he had a financial advisor, he had a production advisor, he had all the advisors that are recommended that you have today, because you can't farm on your own, you have to have an advisor. And he asked the bank for enough money to buy 200 steers. He had enough corn to finish 200 steers, and finishing cattle is about 120 to 140 day process. He did that, and he went, finished the cattle, consumed the corn, went back to the bank, and paid the bank. He made enough money to pay his note, the interest on the note, and that was it. And the banker congratulated him for being such a wonderful manager. And he said, well, I didn't make any money. He said, well, look what you've got left. You've got all the manure left for fertilizer. You can grow more corn. Oh, he said, as a matter of fact, next year, we'll loan you the money to buy 400 steers. So they did. Came back in, same thing. God, you were a marvelous manager. You made enough money. You paid us back. You paid the interest. But I don't have any money, said the farmer. Said, well, you got twice as much fertilizer. Look what you've accomplished. Next year, we've had a meeting, and we'll loan you enough money to buy 1,000 steers. Well, they did. And later, 140 days or 50 days later, the banker's phone rang, and picked it up, and it was Farmer Joe. I said, how you doing? He said, oh, I'm just great. And he said, well, what's happening? He said, well, I sold the steers. And, oh, great. And he said, I'm in Mexico. I've got the money. You can have the shit. And that just reminded me of how agriculture is working today. So, you know, we've had a myth taught to us, all of us, about supply and demand. And if I'll give you a sample of that, my good friend Randy did a chart some time ago on how supply and demand really works. Actually, Norm did a study a few years back just on wheat. And there's lots of statistics in the US, pretty accurate data, and probably as good a statistical system as exists on the planet is here in the US. But he did the statistics on wheat from 1900 through, I think, 2012. Every aspect of wheat you could find, how much was produced, how much was consumed, how much was exported, how much was imported, all of those factors, and discovered that in 112 years, not one year did supply reflect the price of wheat. So the myth of supply and demand was ruptured with the data. It proved it's just not so. Now, when we had the collapse in 2008, here's an interesting statistic. In 2006, there was a 10.8 billion bushel corn crop, and the price was $2.28 a bushel. 2012, we had a 193% increase in the volume of corn. The price moved to $6.67. So thanks, Randy, for that. Explain how we increased the production by that much and had 193% increase in the price. Do you think that's supply and demand? Explain it. Well, the economists all have, that's international demand and all that stuff. It's nonsense. It's the same number 2 yellow corn. An absence of a stable price means we can't have a stable economy. And in life, and certainly on the farm, stable prices, a stable income are a requirement. Stability is a good thing. Out of stability, innovations come. There's nobody that can be as good as stewards of the land as the people who live there and produce on it. And today, they're not being allowed to be those stewards because you have to chase that elusive dollar and under the guise of feeding the world. Feeding the world, I'll give you an example of how feeding the world works in case you're mystified by it. Historically, Mexico has been self-sufficient in producing corn, and they consume a lot of corn as human food, far more than the US does. They were self-sufficient. Along comes Clinton and Robert Rubin and a lot of economists and a lot of bankers that said, that's not very wise. Mexico is a great market for the US farmer. So what let's do is we'll create a trade agreement. We'll have a trade agreement and we'll start supplying Mexico with corn at a better price. So we did, created NAFTA. We displaced 15 million Mexican subsistence farmers so that American farmers could feed the world. Now, nobody asked those farmers if they approved of it. So what do you think happened to 15 million subsistence farmers in Mexico? Oh, perhaps maybe that's the people that are coming to our borders because Mexico has no social network. They have no safety net. What did you expect them to do once we took away their livelihood? And yes, we did. Not accidentally, but on purpose, with no consideration of their lives, of their families, of their communities, so we could sell more corn. And by the way, to sell more corn, we have to mine the soil. It's not ecologically sound, as Frederick Soddy almost basically talked about without having the data that we do. It's not sound practice to run the world in that fashion. So I'm not sure how Randy wants to continue with this, but my purpose here is to tell you from a producer's standpoint how things work out in rural America. And not necessarily to tell you my story, but the world has changed so much in the last 40 years in agriculture that there's not much similarities to it. But the things that are happening, over the last few years, large ranching enterprises in the West, because it can't be profitable, are being purchased by big money interests. The Walton family has bought up very quietly. I'm not sure how much, but I know they purchased one ranch in Wyoming that's 1 million acres. And I stopped there this summer just to look because I was familiar with that operation. We had leased grassland there many years back, and it was one of the best managed ranches in America. The weeds were growing, windows were broken in the house. They have no interest in operating that ranch as a going concern or doing anything that's sound as far as production. I think they're just investing as a shelter for money or as safety. But the absence of profit in rural America is moving the ownership of the resource into the hands of the few. And to have an agriculture that's run that way does not spell much for the future of America. To me, one of the geniuses of the founding fathers, and certainly with Jefferson playing a major role, is we need individual owners of the land, and they'll take care of the land and they'll feed us and clothe us, but they can't do it unless they're paid. And along that line, I make a suggestion frequently. If the price of wheat that is set by the big board, and it is, it's not set by supply and demand, it's set by the futures market. If that's fair, if that's reasonable to allow the price of wheat to fluctuate every 5 seconds, I suggest we expand that theory. Put teachers' salaries on the big board. Put lawyers' fees on the big board. Appendectomies on the big board. If it's fair for agriculture, it's certainly fair for the rest of the economy. Now, I would submit to you, if we did that on Monday, on Tuesday, that would change because nobody would tolerate it. It would just, nobody would accept it, but people in agriculture just take it as a matter of course because there's nothing can be done about it. Now, as Randy has pointed out, and as Joe has pointed out, the laws that will put us back onto a stable economy, a par economy, are all on the books. All we need is those people who can tell the bankers that you don't own this country, that we do, and to ensure that rural America prospers, because if rural America prospers, so will the rest of the nation. And as it declines, those of you who live in the big cities, I'm not sure if what you want is more and more people pouring into the city and more people that aren't able to earn a living and need welfare of some form, and a dependency on the federal government and producing nothing. And of course, as a NORM member and an advocate of a par economy, we oppose quite strenuously the theory of guaranteed national income, because you're producing money with no wealth. You're giving people money without doing anything. We're not producing anything. And it would appear to us that that would transfer more power to a central authority and rather than decentralize the country into an economy that works for everyone. So I'm hoping that Randy is close by, that he can chime in whenever it's appropriate.
Sure, Tom. Would you speak a little bit to the current situation on the pandemic problem, the impact on the changing nature of food distribution as opposed to food production? There's generally a confusion between on the user end, we see any disruption in our standard manner of being fed, of obtaining our food, either through grocery stores, restaurants, delivery, whatever it might be. And we assume that that is food production writ large. Could you speak to that, particularly with the changing nature of what we're facing in our large urban centers today, about the changing manner in which food distribution networks are being forced into new patterns?
Well, that's both an interesting and an extremely complex topic. I believe the pandemic has just sped up the process. It's been going on for years. You know, when I was a young man in the ranching business, there were several hundred meat packers nationwide. Now we're basically down to 4. When you concentrate things at that level, the risks go up. When there's any kind of disruption, it gets pretty serious. So the disruption in supply isn't at the production end, although there could be, because of the nature of agriculture today and how it's been industrialized. And just in case for those who are listening, the industrialization process for agriculture works at certain levels. Poultry, chickens and turkeys were industrialized years ago. Dairy is being industrialized quite strenuously. The hog industry is industrialized. In my state, as an example, 1975, there was about 4,500 dairies, and the dairies could be anything from 10 milk cows to a couple hundred. October 1st of this year in North Dakota, there were 54. 54.
Right.
4,500. That happened only for one reason. The price of milk could not support the production. At home, there was a proliferation of hog farms, people that had hog barns, confinement barns, because it was a good income supplementation, and you could consume the grain that was produced because there wasn't a good market for it. Now we have whole counties, there isn't a single hog in. It's all been industrialized and concentrated into the hands of a few, but there's none there. There's none there. Oh, and by the way, the industrialization of hogs, for those of you who haven't noticed, if you've complained about the pork chops that you eat, that you don't think they taste very good, that's part of the industrialization process. We need to make them grow faster, have less fat, and what we've done is we've created a product that's as close to inedible as you can get. Chickens are similar. It's not as nutritious, it doesn't taste as good, but that's the consequence of industrialization. Beef, we industrialized the finished end. We concentrated that in giant feedlots around, mostly through the Great Plains and the High Plains in Texas, Colorado, and Kansas. Not in North Dakota. There's virtually no fat cattle in North Dakota. We just produce a lot of raw materials, the grain, and we produce cattle, but they're feeder cattle and they're exported. They should be fed and processed here, but they're not. But industrializing the beef industry has proved to be basically not possible. You can only industrialize it to a certain level, and you need to have more labor to produce the product. It will not lend itself to what a giant feedlot or a giant dairy does. And so, you know, and for those of you who think that beef is not appropriate or it's not efficient, I would remind you to look at through it this lens. If you get in an airplane and look from the Mississippi River to the California shores, you see a few cities, you see some highways, you see some center pivot circles when you're flying, but mostly what you see is grassland. And that grassland, once a beef animal consumes it, it converts it to protein, to meat protein. We don't do a thing. That's just the natural process. So if we manage that resource properly, we have a high quality protein and something that's extremely good for the environment. We both have the economic value of it, and we have the nutritional value of it, and we have the value to the environment. And we're moving so far away from that. Now, to get back to where Randy was, it seems that the pandemic has a tendency today to create shortages, malfunctions, distribution issues. And when you concentrate the distribution in the hands of a few, that puts us at really high risk for things disrupting. And I'll say something to all of you that to me is reflective, and I've stole this from Randy Cook, by the way. Ask the question of yourself, who is the most important person in your life today? And seriously, it's not a joke, it's serious. And I would submit to you, it's the person that fixed your eggs. And if you don't think so, fix your own damn eggs. And also consider that somebody needs to get paid for producing that egg. And to be able to buy it cheap is shortchanging someone out of what they've earned. And when we build an economy on cheating and constantly increasing debt, because there isn't enough to go around unless we use debt, the consequences are certainly dire and probably not well known. The pandemic may have all kinds of unforeseen consequences. Certainly in the retail business, in the retail food industry, restaurants and that, I think the impact is so dire, I'm not sure how they can ever recover from the absence of the income that they're losing. Our governor just put restrictions on here in North Dakota because the pandemic is so serious. We're having the highest incidence in the virus of any state in the nation now, and almost exclusively because we refuse to accept it. We bought Rush Limbaugh. It's a hoax. As a state, we bought it. To a certain degree, we're still buying it. Now there's a mandate. Well, the restaurants have emptied out. There's just nobody there. So they don't really need to have this 50% capacity restriction. They're empty. But the bars have been full. And that's really the source of the expansion of the virus, because we're giving it to each other. And one of the officials, Dr. Burt from Washington, was out and said it's just an abomination that North Dakota is not wearing a mask. And while many of you think that the masks aren't effective, even if they were 10% effective, we should do something to mitigate this pandemic. And we're not doing it very well. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more deaths over the next couple of months before we do this. But as far as the food supply goes, I think we don't know what's going to happen, how this is going to affect us. And it certainly should make us aware that industrialization, the process of just having a handful of people involved in this, is not sound as far as an economy goes or a society. So I hope that answers some of what Randy was trying to extract from me. So.
Yeah, and could you, in wrapping up just a minute, talk a little bit about 50 million buffalo?
Oh yeah, the theory. Yes, I've always been fascinated with the expert. Some years ago, some of you may know about it. There was a husband and wife team from Rutgers. Dr. and Popper was their name, and they created a theory that the Great Plains should have never been farmed, ever. It was a mistake, and we should convert it back to the buffalo commons. Put all of the farmland to grass and get rid of the livestock and just turn buffalo loose on the Great Plains from Texas up to the Canadian border. And they're always saying that, way back before the white man was here, there were 50 to 60 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. I don't know how many of you have ever seen 1,000 head of cattle or 10,000, probably very few of you. How about 50,000 in a feedlot? Get a picture of what that looks like. Get a picture of what 1,000 cows looks like out here on the grass. The absurdity of suggesting that there were 60 million buffalo in the Great Plains. I mean, it's just funny. It's humorous. It's just like saying there was 100 million Indians, you know? Good grief. So I have some problems with the experts who have never been here, who have no idea about the reality of producing anything. And it, to me, it's rather humorous, but it's kind of sad that's how we do things here.
Well, we've got a question here about the difference between parity and subsidy, and as well the role of crop insurance.
Oh, that's a tough topic and misunderstood. First, let's try the crop insurance first. From the mid 70s through the mid 90s, because of the shortfall in agricultural income and the problems in agriculture that weren't recognized, there were disaster programs almost annually for someplace. Someplace had a drought and someplace had floods. So Congress had to vote in appropriations to deal with the problem, almost all demanded by the banking industry, by the way, because they're the ones that were getting the income, or the ones that weren't receiving the income. So in its infinite wisdom in the Clinton administration, they devised federal crop insurance. Oh, it was just genius. That will resolve the problem. Congress will be relieved of their obligation to keep coming up with these disaster programs. So they made federal crop insurance mandatory. If you want to participate in federal farm programs, which, by the way, don't subsidize the price of anything, you're not getting paid for that, you have to buy federal crop insurance. Now, the crop insurance is so horrible that if a guy came to your house to sell it to you for your house, you'd throw him off your porch. It's mandatory. You have to buy. You can't get a loan to farm unless you have federal crop insurance. Now, whether you all realize this or not, 65% of the actual premium of federal crop insurance, of all federal crop insurance policies, is subsidized by the taxpayer. So farmers only paying 35% of the cost. And it's still too high, and it doesn't pay. If you're a farmer and suffer a loss, so you can collect on a claim against the federal crop insurance, you don't even get the check. Did you hear me? You don't get the check. It goes directly to your lender. They don't need your endorsement. That you're just the middleman. So and they claim they've solved the problem of disasters, except if you've noticed, the Trump administration has been pouring money out to mitigate even more disasters. That's all facilitated by the banking industry. They're the ones that are clamoring because if the farmer doesn't have the income, he can't pay his note. So we're doing bank bailouts here with all these programs. We're not doing farm bailouts. That's not my interpretation. That's what the math says.
Right. Well, we're trying to cover these questions here. I guess I could say a word about the difference between parity and subsidy. Parity prices since September of 1937 have been calculated by the United States Department of Agriculture. And they're today, these days, let's say in the last 40 years, they've been published monthly by the USDA. Anybody can download them. It's a monthly report put into the Agricultural Prices publication of USDA. If you go on the NASS website, that's the National Agricultural Statistics Service, you can download their regular monthly report called Agricultural Prices. In that publication is a chart that lists the current parity pricing for a whole list of commodities. But the attitude of Norm, or the observations of Norm, the studies that we've done for 80 years have identified the fact that if the pricing in the marketplace is below par, below parity, or some percentage, fractional percentage of parity, then how can any payment to a farmer be considered a subsidy? If the farmer isn't paid 100% of parity, or as we allow 90%, then the farmer is subsidizing the economy and not the other way around. For today, that number is actually 30%. The parity ratio, as they say in the publication, is 30 or 31. So that means that for every dollar's worth of wealth delivered into the economy, the farmer is paid 30 cents. That's what the big board has brought us.
Well, it's also interesting. If you do the math, the shortfall between the 100% and the 30%, that's 70%.
Right.
Annually is made up with new debt creation, because that's the only way the economy can function. You have to make up that shortfall. The myth about parity, especially out in the countryside, agricultural producers are like the rest of the economy. They're ignorant. They haven't been taught what this means. Most people that are agricultural producers, when you try to talk to them about parity, they think it's the cost of production plus a profit. Well, there's a factor in the calculations that does relate to the cost of production, but that's not it. It's the purchasing power of any given agricultural product, such as a bushel of wheat, compared to a time period when it was in balance. So I explained it that this may relate to, for those who are listening who don't have a basic knowledge of this. I explained it to a barber a few weeks ago, and he was charging $21 for a haircut. I said, if you were a good farmer, what you would do is you would reduce the price of that haircut to $7 and make up the difference with cutting more heads of hair. Mm-hmm. And his comment was, no, I don't think I want to do that. I said, no, that's how it is. Unless instead of that, you just borrow the difference and you owe it to the bank. Which one would you like? And that's what we're doing in agriculture. And that's what parity actually isn't, to subsidize farmers or to create farmers having a higher standard of living or any of that. No, it's to make the economy function without the need for including new debt all the time. And that's, since we went off parity, and certainly since Bretton Woods in 1944, the entire country has moved from a production-based economy, an earned income economy, to a debt-based economy, where now there's no money that isn't debt. And that's what Joe was trying to talk about earlier, is, the Constitution takes care of this. I would like to add in that part of the Constitution that calls for the government to create the money and regulate the value thereof. It's interesting to note that the founding fathers had enough wisdom where in the same sentence they added "and of weights and measures."
Fixing the standard, right?
Because think about this. What if at the grocery store you buy your bananas, the grocery store controlled the scale that weighs them? Right. Would that create trust in you? Now there's a sticker at every grocery store that the state applies that the scale has been inspected, so that scale is accurate and you can trust that those bananas you're buying, that's what they weigh. And it's also interesting to note that authority was surrendered by the federal government to the state. Every state has its own mechanism of regulating weights and measures. In North Dakota, regulating the scales where all the grain is produced is now being converted to the private sector.
Right.
So it's being done by contract, by the grain companies themselves, because it's more efficient.
This is not.
Think about that for a while. Just think about that. How is that going to engender trust? And if we don't have an economy or a society where we trust each other, and we're all just predators or worrying about being preyed upon, how does that make our society work? So the fact that weights and measures are included there, it tells me how serious the founding fathers took the things that we now just dismiss out of hand. I find that troubling.
Well, and we've got another question here about the idea of parity being similar to fixing the value of a silver coin to be a cow or a bushel of grain or whatever. And Stephen Zarling referred to that fact regarding some ancient civilizations. I guess what I'd like to say is that in modern day, our modern day development of parity, the idea of parity pricing is not a fixed price. The parity price is calculated to include the costs of labor and capital in the rest of the economy. In other words, it is a relationship. It is not a calculated fixed price. As the other parts of the economy rise or fall in their cost analysis, those are reflected, those changing costs are reflected in the calculation of any particular parity price. And so a parity price is not a fixed price. It's a price that's calculated according to the costs in the rest of the economy. That's what keeps it in balance. That's what keeps the economy in balance when we implement parity pricing for the foundation of our economy. Another point I'd like to say here is that it's important that you understand that agriculture is not commerce. And commercial considerations being applied to agriculture will fail, as they have already come to fail us in terms of pink slime, in terms of alternative meat, in terms of the concentration of dairy herds, of livestock herds in feeding lots. As Tom was saying, the planting of corn where grass should be growing. These are commercial considerations imposed upon agriculture because of money flows that are unrelated to the process of agricultural production. Our economy starts with agriculture. Commerce cannot begin until agriculture delivers. Even mining, the other raw material components of our economy, the mines, minerals, metals, fuels, all of that, every roustabout I know of working an oil well rig ate breakfast. That puts eggs and sausage and toast at the top of the list. Agriculture turns over the quickest of any of our raw material production. And in any balanced year, according to our research, agricultural raw materials are 70% by volume of all annual raw materials delivered to our economy. And so those considerations put the role of agriculture, and even Sadi recognized this, as the primary one in our economic accounting. And we need to pay attention to that. We need to make sure that to obtain a balanced economic operation, we put agriculture in the proper ratio or relationship to the rest of the economy. And so, yes, it's similar to those folks weren't stupid. I mean, they were trying to serve their people, their population as well. Absolutely. They recognized the importance of that. They were even more dependent upon agriculture than we are.
Well, to me, the genius of when Wilkin and Ray discovered the ratios about running a par economy The genius is that it's flexible, that it changes with the state of the arts of technology. That's why it's calculated every 30 days by law, the parity prices, and then it's annualized. But it's self-regulating. It isn't static, it's self-regulating. And when other parts of the economy get more efficient via technology or something, actually the parity price of wheat over the last couple of years has declined because there's other factors that are calculated into it that made that parity price decline. But still, the shortfall between the parity price and the price that's being paid is by necessity being made up for with new debt. If we don't make up for that with new debt, the economy would grind to a halt. Actually, that's what the recessions, or the recessions and depressions, are an interesting phenomenon in our economy. A recession is when you're out of work. A depression is when I'm out of work. And that's basically the real difference. The 2008 recession still hasn't been resolved. We're still dealing with the consequences of it. And it's just not observed very well. And it's really been hidden quite well by the banking finance industry. But it's about to have some of these Band-Aids be torn off, because if people aren't earning enough money to sustain themselves and can't borrow it, there's got to be some adjustments made, and they're not going to be very pretty. And by the way, the parity calculations are done by law every 30 days. They're part of the permanent farm bill. And we were involved in a lawsuit in '95 where Congress actually tried to kill the permanent feature of that so that they would stop calculating it, and that we were successful. Not as in the lawsuit, but the pressure of that forced them to drop that portion. And to my knowledge, since 1995, there hasn't been a proposal to kill that part of the farm bill that does the calculations.
Yeah, we've got another question here about, yes, food is different, yes. And as the peasant farmers have been saying in the international trade agreements, yes, very much so. Food is different. Food agriculture it's survival. It's not business. It has to do with the existence of our civilization, our societies. It is not business. It's not commerce. It's survival. Yes, water, air. I mean, let's look at the hierarchy of needs. First is air, and then water, and then food, and then we have to have some shelter, which is both housing and clothing. And, we can tick them off right down the line. But the efforts required to deliver this stuff, get it produced and deliver it to the people, distribute it, this is the role of money. Read Frederick Soddy. He says so. The role of money is the distribution of wealth. That's what it's for. And what are we doing with it? As Tom said, we pay 30 cents on the dollar for the wealth, and then we wonder why we have to make more new deficits each year, add more to the debt each year. It's it's silly. It's stupid. It's ignorant. Is unnecessary. And there are times in our past as a United States of America where we didn't have to do that. And that's what Norm has studied. We looked at a whole stretch of years. In fact, once we got the analysis begun, looked at it all the way back to the revolutionary times. And the times when the economy was functioning in balance, the same relationships began to display themselves. So we wound up being able to identify the characteristics of prosperous periods in our own history, and they were implemented by policy at the beginning of World War II, and by happenstance and good fortune, mostly due to the extreme fear that was rampant in Congress after the attack by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. These policies were enacted, And by the end of the war, they kept us from having a depression following World War II, which was not our experience following World War I. But those are the bare outlines of what our research contains. Let me see if I can get some other questions going here.
Well, I would like to add something to that. The practical application here, where I'm from in Southwest North Dakota, one of the things that's given me and my wife extreme pain is what's happened in where we grew up and where we lived most of our life. This spring, we took a drive from where I went to high school and to where my wife grew up. It's 40 miles in between. And it's 40 miles of gravel road, okay? 40 miles, and very poor gravel road, as a matter of fact. And historically, that's another interesting question. It's 40 miles of gravel. We drove that Memorial Day weekend. There's 5 farms along that 40 miles. 5. Now there's other farms that are further off the road, but there's 5 farms left. When I was in high school, there was about 30. Now, do you think that that's just the consequence of getting better and more efficient and all of those things? And if it was so, which it isn't, don't you think that we as a society should be questioning that? And is that the kind of society we want to live in? Where the towns that were supported by that agriculture are now not just dying, they're disappearing. And is that what we really want? And where are those people going that are being displaced? Those of you who live in the urban society, you're getting them. And you're going to have to pay the bill for all of the infrastructure that's needed to support them. When a sound agriculture, they would be, that doesn't mean that the technology won't be utilized and we won't have less farms than we did in 1900. That's just absurd. But to suggest that all these things are being done for efficiency and trying to feed the world is pure nonsense, pure nonsense. And we need to, analyze that and stop believing this nonsense.
Yeah, we've got a comment here about the role of money not being to distribute wealth. I have to take issue with that because the role of money, I agree with Sadi that it is to distribute the wealth. And the point is that it is the wealth production that puts the value in money, not the other way around. Wealth or money does not determine the value of wealth in terms of money. That's what we do now. It's wrong. It's damaging. It has led us to exactly where we are. And it's part of the problem we have to overcome in order to get monetary reform. We have to begin to return to a time or a process of putting the purchasing power in money by the wealth we produce. We have to establish the buying power of our money in terms of wealth, not in terms of money.
I think what Randy and I both agree on, and I think Joe also, and all the people that are on this, participating in this conference that are advocates of monetary reform. What we're talking about is the mechanism by which monetary reform can be achieved. And if you skip the monetization of what we grow and produce to feed ourselves, all the new wealth, if we don't do that, I think monetary reform is a myth. It can't be done unless you include that production in monetary reform. Here in North Dakota, we have now become major oil producers. We're the second largest oil producer in the nation now, behind Texas, with the Bakken and the fracking. There's about 16,000 fairly new oil wells. When the price collapsed last spring, oh, by the way, it collapsed one day to minus $39 a barrel. I don't know if any of you remember that. That's because the futures market controls the price of oil. In other words, for those of you who aren't familiar with the futures market and how it works, you had to pay somebody $39 to take a barrel of oil. Now, that only lasted for a couple of days and it was an anomaly. But the price of oil that collapsed then still hasn't recovered. The consequences of that are positive for the consumer because we have gas at $1.95 a gallon. But we're not paying the true cost of the oil. Consequence of that was in the oil patch, thousands of people have left. Hundreds of businesses have gone bankrupt. Is that of benefit to society and to the economy? Just so we can have cheap oil? Well, it's true of cheap food too. And I'll do what Carl Wilkins said. Cheap food means hungry people. And I'd like you to, people who are listening in on this, to consider that as a statement. Cheap food means hungry people. You can't have it for free.
Well, cheap food means hungry people. That's what it comes down to. Now, we do need to talk about the agriculture's role in foreign trade or foreign commerce. I think the first observation regarding monetary reform and foreign trade is the place I'd like to start with that discussion. If we want to have an in-depth discussion, it could go on for days. And but the biggest thing is that international trade is our best ability to purchase foreign products is when we as a nation are earning our way as best we can at our height of earning potential. Then we can have the buying ability to obtain foreign products or services at the greatest rate. Now, to me, that means that we shouldn't be running deficits. Our debt should be at least holding its own, if not shrinking. That's our earnings. Our earnings go towards that. So when we are earning our way to the best of our ability, then is when we are able to buy or obtain in trade foreign products at the greatest rate. And our industries here in the United States were never all that interested in foreign markets, if you will, until our own domestic earnings, our disposable income, consumer disposable income in the United States began to shrink. And as soon as we started sinking below earnings and the domestic market was not being not earning enough to purchase products, then our manufacturers began looking for places to go to reduce their cost structure. And the favorite example of how that works is the 90% problem. If I have experienced the fact that I've got a 90%, today the price dropped, as Tom was saying about oil. Today the price dropped 10%, so I've got 90% of a price. And if by my standard economic thinking, I say, well, gee, if I've got a 90% of a price, then I should cut back 10% of my production so that I'm not overproducing and maybe the price will recover. So I'll produce 90%. Well, the income is created with production times price. How many units did I produce? What is the price per unit? Production times price equals gross income. So if I have a 90% price and a 90% production, how much income does that give me? 9 times 9 is 81. So I have 0.81. I've got 4/5 of an income by cutting my production 10% in the face of a 10% drop in the market price. I've lost almost 20% of my income. That's how that works. So the more we depend upon foreign sources of cheap products, just like we were saying about cheap food, cheap products from overseas displace our own domestic production, and we wind up earning even less And only by the good grace of a banker's line of credit can we keep the whole chain moving, which is part and parcel of how we have gotten into such a situation we have with too much money and not enough production, and treating portions of our own domestic economy as though they really just, well, they're nice people, but they smell bad. So foreign trade is the easiest way to think of it is that we as a nation need to depend upon our own wealth production to set the value of our money. And we need to maintain that in the face of the world at large, because it is us. We don't make the decisions for Great Britain. We don't make the decisions for Mexico. At least we shouldn't be. That's highly presumptuous, and I'm sure galling to the Mexicans. That's not our province.
One of the things that Joe pointed out when he was going through the Saudi stuff that I think is noteworthy, the average person here, and I would include me in certainly in parts of that, has no idea how banking in America works. Right. Absolutely no clue. And when you try to explain it, they said, no, it can't work that way. It's not possible. They can't create money in a bank. It's not possible. It can't be done. You deposit your check in there from your earnings as a wage earner, and the bank holds that for you, and then they lend that out to people, and they get that back, and they make money on it.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
That doesn't work that way, and it hasn't for decades. And the public, I think if the public understood how our monetary financial system was being run, they would demand an end. But they don't know, and right. They're ignorant of those facts. And I don't think we can get sound monetary reform until the public knows more about this. And it may take a collapse of all this to facilitate them trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, there's a question about whether most places can produce adequate food, but their internal markets and agriculture being disrupted by our foreign trade, which has happened time and again. We do that. That's the result of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is funded by the Commodity Credit Corporation nowadays, and by PL 480, or Foreign Export Subsidy Act. Yes, which are all subsidies to commercial corporate interests and are actually interferences in foreign economic matters. Now, we claim, I'm sure in the literature, that it is for their benefit, not ours. But nonetheless, the idea that farmers are feeding the world is part and parcel of those policies. In order to get those vast quantities of exportable commodities, we have to confirm that our farmers are going to be following the party line and producing enough so that the corporations can take advantage of that and throw it around the world, essentially to make a partial stab at having some exchangeable material for industrial imports here. So yeah, foreign trade is, particularly in agriculture, is damaging to the foreign farmer. It's damaging to the domestic farmer. And I don't know of any place in the world that the farmer himself, wherever he is, would not benefit from a rise in prices. And yet the pricing structure the world around is maintained at a poverty level. That, in my view, is the biggest source of poverty other than famines and the inability to adapt to a changing environment. Now I don't think that's a new thing. I think we've been facing that as long as we've been on the planet. But you'd think we'd get better at recognizing it and finding solutions that include people rather than using them as war material.
Well, it's led to a lot of strange beliefs. As I mentioned earlier, our policy with Mexico and corn. how harmful it was to everybody except the people that are financing it and the traders that make money. We did the same thing in Pakistan with wheat. Pakistan was self-sufficient in wheat. We wanted bases, we wanted all kinds of things in Pakistan. So we decided to disrupt the domestic wheat market, and through the US aid, dump our wheat on Pakistan, which has disrupted their domestic production for political purposes. And there's a few people make a lot of money on that process. But it's not good for Pakistan to not be self-sufficient in something, some mechanism of feeding themselves to become dependent. And it certainly cannot rise them out of poverty.
Right.
You can't. So what is our policy? Is our policy to help the world standard of living, to reduce poverty? I'm not a utopianist. This isn't going to disappear overnight. But if our policy isn't intended on helping them rise out of poverty, if it's just for money, monetary or political purposes, how do you think they're going to feel about us in those countries? And is that the way you make peace, or is that the way you create enemies?
Right. Well, I think I should close. Am I correct on the timing here? We're about time for a break here.
Yeah, yes, Randy. And we're getting close to some powerful ideas in terms of a parity tariff, and maybe we can come towards that in the panel. If this video is helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe for new video notifications. Please consider donating at monetary.org/donate. Don't forget to check us out on Twitter at AMI Monetary or on our website